In 1912, 18 deputies took Wesley Edwards from this road. They said he'd stolen $40. They tied him, dragged him down Main Street, turned his pain into a crowd's amusement. 3 days later, the real thief confessed.
The Virginia Bloodbath of 1912. Wesley Edwards hunted 18 deputies who hog-tied him like an animal. The most devastating act of vengeance against local authority in Virginia history, and the most methodical campaign of retribution the Blue Ridge Mountains had ever witnessed from a man defending his honor and dignity. This is the true story of Wesley Edwards. Our story begins in the rugged mountain section of Buchanan County, Virginia, known throughout the region as one of the most isolated and fiercely independent corners of the state. The Appalachian ridges rise here in ancient folds that have sheltered families for generations, peaks and hollows that seem designed to hide those who wish to remain hidden from the world beyond. The people who settled these mountains came seeking freedom from interference, and their descendants maintained that spirit through centuries of conflict with authorities who never understood that these hills had their own laws, their own justice, their own ways of handling matters that outsiders had no business involving themselves in. You see, in Buchanan County in the early 20th century, honor was not merely a concept, but the foundation upon which all social relations were built. A man's word was his bond, his reputation was his currency, and his dignity was something that could not be violated without consequence. The mountain people had developed over generations a code that governed their interactions, a system of understood rules that determined how disputes were settled, how insults were answered, how wrongs were made right. This code existed outside the official legal system, and in many ways was more effective at maintaining order than anything the county sheriff could impose. The conflict between local law enforcement and the mountain communities had been simmering for decades by the time our story begins. The sheriffs and deputies who were elected or appointed to maintain order often came from the lowland towns, men who did not understand mountain ways and who viewed the highland people with a mixture of contempt and fear. They saw lawlessness where there was merely a different kind of law, saw criminality where there was merely tradition, saw threats where there was merely independence. The enforcement they brought was often heavy-handed, designed to demonstrate dominance rather than to achieve justice. The man who would become known throughout Virginia simply as Wesley Edwards was born in 1878 in a cabin on the banks of Dismal Creek that his grandfather had built with his own hands before the Civil War. He was the fifth of 7 children, born into a family that had worked this land since the first settlers arrived, that had fought in every American war, that had buried 4 generations in the small cemetery on the ridge above the home place. The independence that defined the mountain people was in his blood as natural to him as breathing. That's right. Wesley Edwards had grown up in a world where a man was measured by his integrity, where his word meant everything, where his willingness to stand up for himself and his family determined his place in the community. He had learned early that the world was divided into those who could be trusted and those who could not, that some offenses could be forgiven and others demanded answer, that a man who allowed himself to be humiliated without response had forfeited his right to respect. These lessons shaped everything he would later become. His childhood had been marked by the rhythms of farm life, the endless cycle of planting and harvesting that sustained families who lived close to the land. He had learned to work from the time he could walk, had absorbed the understanding that survival required effort, that nothing was given freely, that a man earned what he had through labor and skill. He developed the strength that mountain life required, a physical power that would later prove significant in ways his parents could never have imagined. His education had been practical rather than academic, focused on the knowledge that mountain life required. He learned to read well enough to manage household accounts, to do arithmetic sufficient for trading, to absorb the basic learning that the one-room schoolhouse could provide during the months when he was not needed at home. But his real education came from his father and uncles, who taught him the skills of hunting and farming and the unwritten rules that governed mountain society. His marriage to a woman named Martha Ann Deal in 1899 had been a love match that united 2 respected families in the Dismal Creek community. Martha was a strong woman who shared her husband's values, who understood the code by which they lived, who would support him through everything that was to come. Together they built a life on land that Wesley's father had given them, raising crops and children and livestock with the devotion that mountain families brought to everything they did. Martha had come from a family that was equally respected in the community, her father being a man known for his integrity and his willingness to help neighbors in need. She had been raised with the same values that Wesley held dear, had absorbed the understanding that a family's honor was something to be protected at all costs. Her support for her husband would prove crucial in the years that followed, her strength providing the foundation that allowed him to do what needed to be done. The courtship between Wesley and Martha had been a traditional one, conducted under the watchful eyes of both families, proceeding according to the customs that mountain people had followed for generations. They had known each other since childhood, had grown up attending the same church and the same community gatherings, had developed a fondness that eventually blossomed into love. Their wedding had been celebrated by the entire community, a recognition that two good families were being united. The children came steadily through the years that followed, 5 of them in all, 3 boys and 2 girls. The Edwards homestead became a prosperous place by mountain standards, Wesley's hard work and careful management producing results that his neighbors acknowledged with respect. He was known throughout the community as a man who kept his word, who dealt fairly with everyone, who minded his own business but who would not allow himself or his family to be mistreated. His reputation was spotless, which made what happened in the spring of 1912 all the more devastating. The eldest son, William, was born in 1900, a strong boy who showed every sign of growing into a man like his father. The first daughter, Elizabeth, arrived in 1902, followed by another son, James, in 1904. The second daughter, Mary, was born in 1907, and the youngest, Thomas, arrived in 1910. The cabin that had started as a simple structure had been expanded over the years to accommodate the growing family, each addition representing Wesley's improving circumstances. By 1912, Wesley Edwards was 34 years old, in the prime of his life, a substantial farmer with a respected position in the community. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with broad shoulders built by years of hard labor and hands that could gentle a frightened horse or fell an adversary with equal facility. His dark hair had not yet begun to gray. His eyes held the sharpness of a man who missed nothing. His bearing reflected the confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was and what he was worth. Now, to understand what happened on the morning of April 15th, 1912, you need to understand the particular circumstances that had made Wesley Edwards a target for the county sheriff's attention. That's right. A dispute had arisen over timber rights on land that bordered Edwards' property, a conflict that pitted Wesley against a lowland businessman named Harrison Blackwell, who had powerful connections in the county government. Blackwell claimed rights to timber that Wesley believed belonged to him, and when Wesley refused to allow Blackwell's men to cut the trees in question, the businessman had used his political influence to turn the dispute into a criminal matter. The warrant that Sheriff Thomas Garrett carried on that April morning charged Wesley Edwards with assault, claiming that he had attacked Blackwell's timber agents when they attempted to exercise their legal rights. The charge was false, as everyone in the community knew. Wesley had merely refused to allow the agents onto his property, had stood at the boundary with his rifle and informed them that they were trespassing, had done nothing that any property owner would not have done under similar circumstances. But Blackwell had money and influence, and the sheriff owed his position to the same political machine that served Blackwell's interests. Sheriff Garrett assembled a force of 18 deputies for the arrest, a number that far exceeded anything the situation required. The excessive show of force was deliberate, intended to humiliate Edwards by demonstrating that the law could do whatever it wanted to mountain people regardless of justice or reason. Several of the deputies had been specifically recruited for their willingness to use violence, their reputations for brutality preceding them throughout the county. What was planned for that morning was not merely an arrest, but a demonstration of power, and that's when the nightmare began to unfold. You see, the morning of April 15th, 1912, had started like any other spring day on Dismal Creek. Wesley had risen before dawn to begin the morning chores, had eaten breakfast with Martha and the children, had been preparing to head to the upper pasture when the sound of horses announced the arrival of visitors. He walked out to meet them, expecting perhaps neighbors or traders, finding instead nearly 20 armed men arranged in a semicircle around his cabin. Sheriff Garrett announced the warrant in a voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear, clearly intended to maximize the humiliation of what was about to occur. Wesley listened without expression, asked to see the warrant, examined it with the careful attention of a man who understood that documents could be challenged. He stated calmly that the charges were false, that he had assaulted no one, that he was willing to accompany the sheriff to answer the accusations through proper legal channels. What happened next would be debated for years, with the sheriff's official report claiming that Edwards had resisted arrest and that the deputies had been forced to subdue him. The version told by neighbors who witnessed the scene from their own properties was very different. They described how the deputies had surrounded Edwards, how they had beaten him without provocation, how they had knocked him to the ground and continued to strike him even after he had ceased to resist. They described how Martha had run out of the cabin screaming, how the deputies had pushed her back, how the children had watched from the windows as their father was brutalized. But the beating was not the worst of it. After Wesley had been subdued, after he lay bleeding and barely conscious on the ground, Sheriff Garrett ordered his deputies to hog-tie him. They bound his wrists behind his back, bent his legs up behind him, and connected his wrists to his ankles with a rope that forced his body into an agonizing arch. They then attached another rope to this binding and used it to drag him across the yard to where their horses waited, pulling him through the mud and manure like an animal being taken to slaughter. The position was designed to cause maximum suffering. Wesley's shoulders were pulled back painfully, while his legs were forced up behind him, creating an arch in his spine that became excruciating within minutes. The rope connecting his wrists to his ankles meant that any movement to relieve the pressure on one part of his body only increased the pain in another. The deputies knew exactly what they were doing, had used this technique before on prisoners they wanted to break. The humiliation was deliberate and complete. The deputies laughed as they dragged him, made jokes about the mountain hog they had caught, took their time ensuring that the degradation was witnessed by as many people as possible. They commented on his clothing, on his farm, on his family watching from the porch. They made crude suggestions about what they might do to Martha after her husband was safely locked away, comments designed to provoke Wesley into resistance that would justify further violence. Martha watched from the porch, held back by deputies who threatened her when she tried to intervene. Her screams could be heard throughout the hollow, the anguish of a wife watching her husband reduced to something less than human. The deputies who restrained her made their own comments, threats that carried an undertone of violence that was unmistakable. The children watched through the window, their father reduced to something less than human before their eyes. William, the eldest at 12, pressed his face against the glass, his expression showing a mixture of horror and rage that he was too young to fully process. The younger children cried without understanding what they were witnessing, knowing only that something terrible was happening to their father. The neighbors who had gathered at the sound of the commotion watched in horror, understanding that what they were witnessing was not law enforcement but public torture. They wanted to intervene, but the deputies were armed and clearly looking for any excuse to expand the violence. The community was being taught a lesson, and Wesley Edwards was the object lesson they had chosen. The humiliation was deliberate and complete. The deputies laughed as they dragged him, made comments about teaching mountain people their place, joked about what they would do to his wife after he was locked away. They paraded him through the community in this fashion, stopping at neighboring farms to display their prize, ensuring that everyone who knew Wesley Edwards would see him reduced to something less than human. The journey to the county seat took most of the day, with Wesley bound and dragged behind the horses for miles, his body torn and bleeding from the rocks and roots he was pulled over. Martha followed on foot, unable to keep pace with the mounted deputies but determined to reach her husband, to be present when he arrived at the jail, to bear witness to what was being done to him. The children were left with neighbors, their young minds scarred by what they had seen, their understanding of the world forever changed by the morning's events. The community watched in horror, understanding that what had been done to Wesley Edwards could be done to any of them, that the law had become an instrument of tyranny rather than justice. The charges against Wesley were dismissed within a week, the evidence so transparently fabricated that even a judge friendly to Blackwell's interests could not sustain them. But by then the damage had been done. Wesley had been held in the county jail for 7 days, his injuries untreated, his dignity destroyed, his reputation as a man who could not be pushed around shattered by the public display of his helplessness. He emerged from that jail a different person than he had been when he entered, transformed by an experience that he could never forget and never forgive. The aftermath of his release was watched closely by the community, who understood that the code by which they all lived demanded a response to what had been done. Wesley said nothing publicly, made no threats, showed no outward signs of the rage that must have been consuming him. He returned to his farm, resumed his work, attended church with his family, appeared to be exactly what his enemies hoped he would be, a broken man who had learned his lesson about defying those with power. But those who knew Wesley Edwards well, who could read the signs that others missed, understood that something fundamental had changed. There was a stillness in him that had not been there before, a quality of patient waiting that suggested a mind working ceaselessly on problems that could not be shared. Martha noticed it, spoke of it to no one, understood without being told what her husband was planning and why she could not ask him to abandon it. The honor that had been stolen could only be reclaimed through blood, and the blood would flow when Wesley was ready. And that readiness, when it came, would unleash a campaign of vengeance that would shake Buchanan County to its foundations. The planning process took 6 months, during which Wesley Edwards maintained the appearance of a man resigned to his humiliation. He worked his farm, traded with his neighbors, attended to the ordinary business of mountain life with no visible signs of the rage that burned within him. The deputies who had brutalized him grew confident, then complacent, then careless, believing that the mountain man they had broken would never dare to retaliate against the representatives of law and order. The intelligence he gathered during those months was comprehensive and methodical. He learned the identities of every deputy who had participated in his arrest, their names known to him from that morning, but their habits, their routines, their vulnerabilities requiring careful study. He watched them from distances they never suspected, noted when they traveled alone and when they traveled in groups, identified the patterns that would allow him to strike when they were most vulnerable. His network of informants extended throughout the mountain community, people who shared his grievance against the sheriff's department and who were willing to provide information without asking what it would be used for. The mountain grapevine carried news that the lowland authorities never saw, communications that flowed through kinship networks and church gatherings and chance encounters at the general store. Wesley collected this intelligence and analyzed it with the patience that his task required. The weapons he would use were those he had always owned, the rifles and pistols that every mountain man possessed, tools that served equally for hunting game and for defending what was his. He practiced his marksmanship in remote hollows, where the sound of gunfire would not be noticed, recovering skills that had grown rusty during years of peaceful farming. The preparations were thorough, patient, reflecting a determination that had replaced every other emotion in his heart. The first killing came in October 1912, 6 months after the humiliation that had started everything. The target was a young deputy named James Fowler, who had been among the most enthusiastic participants in Wesley's brutalization, who had been seen laughing as he dragged the bound man through the mud, who had made obscene comments about what he intended to do to Martha once her husband was out of the way. Fowler was found shot dead on a mountain road outside Grundy, killed by a single rifle shot from a distance that demonstrated remarkable marksmanship. The killing of James Fowler was initially attributed to the general lawlessness that characterized the region, assumed to be the result of some personal dispute or criminal conflict unrelated to his work as a deputy. No one officially connected the death to the farmer who had been hog-tied 6 months before. No one imagined that Wesley Edwards, who had appeared so thoroughly broken, could be capable of such calculated violence. The assumption of defeat was Wesley's greatest asset, and he would exploit it throughout his campaign. The second killing came 3 weeks later, targeting another deputy who had participated in the arrest. This man, named Robert Patterson, was found dead in his home outside Vincent, shot through a window while he sat eating his supper. The method was similar to the first killing, the marksmanship equally impressive, the victim equally connected to the events of April 15th. The pattern was beginning to emerge, but the authorities could not yet see it, could not imagine that the killings were connected. or that a humiliated farmer might be systematically eliminating those who had wronged him. The third and fourth killings came in quick succession in November 1912, demonstrating that Wesley's campaign was accelerating. The victims were both deputies from the Garrett Force, both killed with the precision that had characterized the earlier deaths, both discovered in circumstances that suggested careful planning and patient execution. The sheriff's department began to realize that something unusual was happening, that their members were being targeted by someone with knowledge of who they were and where they could be found. That's right. Wesley Edwards continued his campaign through the winter of 1912-1913, striking with a regularity that kept his enemies constantly off balance. The fifth deputy died in December, found floating in the Lavisa Fork with a bullet wound in his back. He had been fishing alone, confident that he was safe in a location miles from any Edwards property. Wesley had tracked him for days, had learned his habits, had waited for the perfect moment when no witnesses would be present. The sixth was ambushed on a remote road in January, his horse found wandering with blood on the saddle, his body discovered in a ravine the next day. The deputy had been traveling between towns, had stopped to rest his horse at a spot that seemed safe, but that Wesley had identified weeks earlier as ideal for an ambush. The single shot that killed him had come from a ridge nearly 300 yards away, demonstrating marksmanship that only years of mountain hunting could produce. The seventh and eighth died on the same night in February, killed in their homes in attacks that demonstrated capabilities no one had suspected the killer possessed. Wesley had recruited help for this coordinated strike, family members who shared his grievance and who were willing to take risks to see justice done. The double killing sent a message that the remaining deputies understood clearly. There was no safety anywhere, not even in their own homes. The terror that spread through the sheriff's department after the coordinated killings was palpable. Deputies began sleeping with weapons beside their beds, began checking their windows and doors obsessively, began seeing threats in every shadow. Some refused to patrol alone, demanding partners who might provide warning if an attack came. Others stopped patrolling entirely, staying close to the county seat, where numbers might provide some protection. The investigation into the killings struggled against an adversary it did not understand. Federal marshals were brought in to assist, but they proved equally helpless against a man who knew every hollow and ridge in the county, who could move through terrain that seemed impenetrable to outsiders, who had the support of a community that viewed him as a hero rather than a criminal. Each killing was executed with care that reflected Wesley's months of preparation. He knew the mountains better than any of the deputies he hunted, could move through terrain that they feared to enter, could approach and disappear without leaving traces that could be followed. The skills of hunting that every mountain man possessed had been adapted to a different kind of prey, and he proved devastatingly effective at this new application. The terror that Wesley created spread through the sheriff's department like a contagion. Deputies who had participated in the Edwards arrest began to request transfers, to claim illness, to find reasons why they could not continue serving. Some resigned their positions entirely, deciding that the modest salary was not worth the constant fear of death. The department found it increasingly difficult to maintain order in a county where anyone who wore a badge had become a target. The investigation into the killings eventually recognized the pattern that connected them. Sheriff Garrett himself began to suspect that someone was seeking revenge for some unspecified grievance, though he could not yet identify who might be responsible. The surveillance of known troublemakers began, but Wesley Edwards was not among those watched. He had appeared so thoroughly broken after his release, had shown no signs of the rage that consumed him, had maintained a mask so perfect that the investigators looked right past him. The ninth killing came in March 1913, nearly a year after the arrest that had started everything. Wesley had saved this date for a target who had been particularly cruel, one of the deputies who had urinated on him while he lay bound and helpless in the mud. The killing was more elaborate than the others, involved a pursuit through the mountains that lasted 2 days, ended with the deputy cornered in a hollow with no escape. What happened in that hollow was never officially recorded, but the condition of the body when it was found suggested that the death had not been quick. The 10th and 11th killings followed in quick succession, each targeting deputies who had been identified as enthusiastic participants in the humiliation. The 12th came in May, the 13th in June, the 14th in July. By summer 1913, 14 of the 18 deputies were dead, and the remaining 4 had fled Buchanan County entirely, seeking safety in other states, where they hoped the Mountain Avenger could not find them. But Wesley Edwards found them anyway, tracking them through networks of information that extended far beyond the county of his birth. The 15th deputy died in Kentucky, shot through his boarding house window as he prepared for bed. The 16th was killed in West Virginia, ambushed on a road outside the mining town where he had sought refuge. The 17th died in Tennessee, his body discovered in an alley behind the tavern where he had been drinking. The 18th and final killing came on April 15, 1913, exactly 1 year after the arrest that had started everything. The target was Sheriff Thomas Garrett himself, the man who had ordered the hog-tying, who had paraded Wesley through the community like an animal, who had orchestrated the humiliation that demanded answer. Garrett had barricaded himself in his home in Grundy, had surrounded himself with the few men still willing to serve as deputies, had taken precautions that he believed would protect him from the fate that had claimed his men. He was wrong about that protection. Wesley Edwards reached him despite every precaution, found a way through defenses that would have stopped anyone less determined. He entered the sheriff's home in the early hours of the morning, bypassed the guards who were supposed to be watching, reached the bedroom where Garrett slept. What passed between them in those final moments was never recorded, known only to Wesley and to the man he killed. But when Garrett's body was found the next morning, the evidence suggested that his death had been neither quick nor merciful. The sheriff had been hog-tied, bound in exactly the same fashion he had ordered for Wesley a year before. He had been beaten, his face showing the marks of fists that had struck again and again, and he had been shot, multiple times in places designed to cause pain rather than immediate death. The final bullet had come only after Garrett had experienced something of what Wesley had experienced, after he had known the helplessness and humiliation that he had inflicted on others. The message was clear to anyone who could read it. The debt had been paid in full. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the campaign ended. Wesley Edwards was arrested 3 days after Garrett's death, identified by evidence found at the scene and by the pattern that connected all 18 killings to the humiliation he had suffered. The case against him was built on circumstantial evidence, on witness testimony from those who had seen him near various crime scenes, on the obvious motive that his treatment provided. He did not deny what he had done, seemed almost proud of it, faced his accusers with the dignity that had been stripped from him a year before. The trial of Wesley Edwards became the most sensational criminal proceeding in Virginia history, drawing national attention and spectators who traveled from across the country to witness the case. The courtroom was packed every day, with crowds gathering outside to follow updates from those fortunate enough to secure seats inside. Newspapers sent reporters from as far as New York and Chicago, making Wesley's story known to millions who had never heard of Buchanan County or Dismal Creek. The scene inside the courtroom was remarkable for its contrasts. The defendant sat quietly, his bearing dignified despite the chains that bound him, his face revealing nothing of what he felt about the proceedings. He was dressed in a clean suit that Martha had brought him, looking more like a prosperous farmer than the killer of 18 men. His composure never wavered throughout the weeks of testimony, even when the prosecution described his killings in graphic detail. The spectators included journalists from across the nation, curious observers who had traveled hundreds of miles, and supporters from the mountain community who packed the galleries whenever space permitted. The latter group was notable for its size and its silence, their presence making a statement without words, their numbers demonstrating that Wesley Edwards was not alone. The prosecution presented its case methodically, connecting Wesley to the deaths through evidence that demonstrated planning and determination. They called forensic experts who analyzed bullet trajectories, who matched weapons to wounds, who built a technical case that was impressive in its detail. They presented witnesses who had seen Wesley in the vicinity of various killings, who had noticed him where he should not have been, who provided pieces of a puzzle that the prosecution assembled into a damning picture. The prosecutor, a state attorney named Charles Morrison, brought in from Richmond, understood the difficulty of his position. He could not afford to appear sympathetic to a defendant who had killed 18 law enforcement officers, but he also could not ignore the circumstances that had driven Wesley to action. His strategy focused on the killings themselves, on their premeditated nature, on the planning that had gone into each one. They portrayed him as a cold-blooded killer who had murdered 18 men, most of them officers of the law, who had shown no mercy regardless of any circumstances his victims might have faced. They demanded the death penalty, arguing that the scope and brutality of his crimes warranted the ultimate punishment. But the trial became something more than a murder prosecution. The defense, led by a lawyer named Thomas Mitchell, who had volunteered to take the case without fee, used the proceedings to put the Buchanan County Sheriff's Department on trial. He called witnesses who testified to the circumstances of Wesley's arrest, to the beating he had received, to the hog-tying that had reduced him to something less than human. He presented evidence that the original charges had been fabricated, that the warrant had been obtained through corruption, that the entire operation had been designed not to enforce the law but to humiliate a man who had dared to stand up for his rights. The testimony about the arrest shocked the courtroom and the nation. Witnesses described how Wesley had offered no resistance, how he had been beaten anyway, how he had been bound and dragged through the mud for miles, while deputies laughed and joked about what they were doing. They described how Martha had been pushed and threatened, how the children had watched in terror, how the entire community had been forced to witness the degradation of a man they respected. The contrast between the dignified farmer, who sat in the defendant's chair, and the animal he had been reduced to was stark and unavoidable. The testimony about the fabricated charges added another dimension to the case. Witnesses confirmed that Wesley had never assaulted anyone, that he had merely defended his property rights against trespassers, that the warrant had been obtained through political influence rather than evidence. The businessman Blackwell was called to testify, squirmed under cross-examination, admitted under oath that he had asked the sheriff to teach Edwards a lesson. The corruption that had produced the arrest was exposed for all to see. The jury deliberated for 5 days, longer than anyone had expected, suggesting that the decision was not as straightforward as either side had hoped. When they finally returned, their verdict reflected the complexity of the case and the community's sympathy for a man whose honor had been destroyed. Guilty of voluntary manslaughter on 18 counts, with a recommendation for the minimum possible sentence. The verdict was a repudiation of the system that had brutalized Wesley Edwards, an acknowledgement that while he had committed terrible acts, the acts committed against him were equally terrible and had received no official censure. The judge, a man named William Harrison who had listened to testimony that had visibly shaken him, sentenced Wesley to 18 concurrent terms of 5 years each, with eligibility for parole after 3 years. It was the most lenient sentence the law would allow. Wesley Edwards served 4 years at the Virginia State Penitentiary before being released on parole in 1917. He was 39 years old, had lost 4 years of his life to imprisonment, had spent an additional year before that planning and executing a campaign that had killed 18 men. He returned to Buchanan County, to the mountains he had never wanted to leave, to the wife and children who had waited for him throughout his time away. The reunion with his family was a moment of profound emotion that those who witnessed it would never forget. Martha had aged during the years of his imprisonment, the strain of maintaining the farm and raising the children alone showing in her face and bearing. But her devotion had never wavered, her faith in her husband remaining absolute throughout the years of separation. When Wesley stepped off the train in Grundy, she was waiting on the platform with the children who had grown from small figures into young adults during his absence. The children had been shaped by their father's story in ways that would influence the rest of their lives. William, the eldest, had taken on the role of man of the house during Wesley's imprisonment, had learned to run the farm, had developed a maturity beyond his years. Elizabeth had helped her mother with the younger children, had become a surrogate parent while still a child herself. All of them had lived with the knowledge of what their father had done and why he had done it, had absorbed both the pride and the burden that such knowledge carries. The years following his release were marked by a quiet determination to rebuild the life that had been shattered. Martha had maintained the farm during his imprisonment, had raised the children with help from the extended family that surrounded them, had kept faith that her husband would return. Their reunion was private, shared only with family and close friends, a moment of healing after years of pain that words could not adequately describe. Wesley never spoke publicly about his campaign, never granted interviews to the journalists who sought him out, never confirmed or denied the details that had emerged during his trial. The silence he maintained was complete, a refusal to revisit events that had consumed years of his life and that he had no wish to relive. When asked about those years, he would simply say that he had done what needed to be done, that any man would have done the same, that the matter was closed. His reputation in the community was complex and sometimes contested. Some viewed him as a hero who had struck back against tyranny, who had demonstrated that mountain people would not accept humiliation without response, who had forced changes in how law enforcement treated the citizens it was supposed to serve. Others viewed him as a murderer whose crimes could not be excused regardless of the provocation, who had taken the law into his own hands with consequences that extended far beyond those who had wronged him. Wesley seemed indifferent to these debates, focused only on the daily work of farming and the quiet joys of family life that he had been denied for so long. His health remained good for many years. The constitution that had sustained him through his campaign and his imprisonment continuing to serve him. He worked the farm as long as he was able, then gradually reduced his activities as age took its toll. The visits to the cemetery where his parents were buried continued until he could no longer make the walk, a ritual that connected him to the generations that had come before and that would come after. He died peacefully in his sleep in 1952 at the age of 74. He had outlived everyone directly involved in his humiliation, had seen 2 world wars and countless other changes in the world beyond the mountains, had watched his children grow up and establish families of their own. He was buried in the family cemetery on the ridge above the home place. The stone that marked his grave bearing only his name and dates, no epitaph that might summarize a life that defied simple description. The aftermath of Wesley Edwards' campaign reshaped law enforcement practices in the mountain regions for a generation. The exposure of what had been done to him, which came out in devastating detail during the trial, generated public outrage that could not be ignored. Investigations were launched into the conduct of sheriff's departments throughout southwestern Virginia, revealing patterns of abuse that extended far beyond Buchanan County. Congressional representatives from Virginia were forced to address the issue, receiving letters from constituents who demanded action. State legislators convened hearings that examined law enforcement practices across the mountain counties, hearing testimony that shocked even those who had suspected problems existed. The accumulated evidence created a picture of systematic abuse that could no longer be ignored or excused. The political consequences were significant and lasting. Sheriff's departments that had operated with impunity found themselves under scrutiny from state authorities who could no longer ignore complaints about excessive force. The corrupt relationships between local businessmen and law enforcement that had produced Wesley's arrest were exposed and dismantled. Officials who had enabled or participated in abuse found their careers quietly ended, their political futures destroyed by association with the scandal. New procedures were established requiring documentation of arrests, limiting the use of force against suspects, mandating humane treatment of those in custody. Training programs were developed that emphasized the rights of citizens, even those accused of crimes, and the limits that officers must observe regardless of their personal feelings about the people they arrested. The reforms that followed were meaningful, though they came too late for Wesley Edwards and for the many others who had suffered similar treatment. The hog-tying of prisoners was explicitly prohibited. The display of suspects for public humiliation was banned. The routine brutality that had characterized many arrests was officially discouraged. The changes did not eliminate all abuses, but they represented a recognition that what had been done to Wesley was unacceptable by any standard of civilized law enforcement. The cultural impact extended beyond policy changes. The Edwards case became a symbol throughout Virginia of what could happen when law enforcement forgot its proper role, when those charged with protecting citizens instead became their tormentors. Parents told their children the story as a warning about the abuse of power, as a reminder that authority could be corrupted, as an example of what ordinary citizens were capable of when pushed beyond endurance. The gravesite where Wesley Edwards rests became a place of quiet pilgrimage for those who remembered the story, visited by people who wanted to pay respects to a man who had refused to accept humiliation without response. The stone that marks his resting place is simple, weathered by decades of rain and wind, but the name carved into it remains legible. Flowers appear there occasionally, left by visitors who have heard the story and want to acknowledge it in some tangible way. The songs that emerged from the Wesley Edwards story varied widely in their approach and message. Some were straightforward ballads that recounted the events in chronological order, from the arrest through the campaign to the trial. These songs celebrated Wesley's determination, described his killings in detail that bordered on admiration, portrayed him as a symbol of mountain resistance to lowland tyranny. They were sung in taverns and at gatherings, becoming part of the oral tradition that preserved mountain history. The first songs appeared within months of the trial's conclusion, composed by local musicians who understood the story's significance. These early ballads were simple, built on traditional melodies with new words. They spread through the mountains by word of mouth, learned by one community and carried to the next, modified and embellished as they traveled until multiple versions existed throughout the region. One popular ballad described the arrest itself, painting a vivid picture of the humiliation that Wesley had endured. The song captured the deputies laughing as they dragged him, the mud and manure through which he was pulled, the display that had been designed to break his spirit. It portrayed his transformation from victim to avenger, from humiliated farmer to hunter of men, from someone who had been reduced to less than human to someone who would demonstrate exactly what he was capable of. The verses described the rope connecting his wrists to his ankles, the agonizing arch his body was forced into, the hours of display as he was paraded through the community. They captured Martha's screams, the children at the window, the neighbors forced to witness. The image became iconic, a symbol of what happens when authority forgets that even the powerless have dignity. Another song told the story from the perspective of the deputies, describing their growing terror as their colleagues died one by one around them. This song was darker than most, capturing the fear that must have consumed men who understood that death was hunting them, that nothing could protect them from the fate they had earned. It described their attempts to flee, their efforts to hide, their final understanding that Wesley Edwards would find them regardless of where they went. The verses imagined sleepless nights, every footstep a potential threat, every shadow hiding the mountain avenger. It portrayed their desperation as they fled to distant cities, their panic as news of each killing reached them, their final moments when they realized distance provided no safety. A third song focused on the anniversary killing. The deputy hog-tied in exactly the same manner he had used on Wesley, forced to experience the same humiliation before death released him. This song was the most brutal, capturing the justice of punishment, matching crime to consequence. It served as a warning about the abuse of authority. A fourth song focused on the relationship between Wesley and Martha, describing the love that had sustained them through the ordeal and that would continue to sustain them after his release. This song was more tender than the others, avoiding the violence of the ballads in favor of a meditation on partnership and loyalty and the bonds that cannot be broken by external forces. It reminded listeners that behind the campaign of vengeance was a man who loved his family and who had been fighting for something more than just his own wounded pride. A fifth song addressed Sheriff Garrett directly, condemning the man who ordered the humiliation and paid with his life. The verses described his attempts to hide, his certainty of safety, his final understanding that the farmer he had degraded would deliver justice the law refused to provide. The most famous song was composed decades later by a professional musician who traveled to Buchanan County to research the story. This comprehensive ballad told the complete story with skill and emotional power, becoming a standard in Appalachian music repertoire. Historians who have studied the Wesley Edwards case have reached varying conclusions about its significance and meaning. Some have analyzed it as an example of resistance to corrupt authority, arguing that the sheriff's conduct during the arrest justified whatever response it provoked. They note that the legal system had been weaponized against Wesley, that his only crime had been defending his property, that the humiliation he suffered was designed to send a message to anyone who might similarly resist the powerful. These scholars have traced the roots of mountain resistance to outside authority back through generations, connecting Wesley's campaign to the broader history of Appalachian independence. The tradition of self-reliance and suspicion of government had developed over centuries of isolation, creating communities that maintained their own systems of justice and order. Wesley Edwards stood at the end of a long line of mountain people who had refused to accept unlimited authority from outsiders. The economic analysis reveals why the timber dispute that triggered Wesley's arrest was so significant. Land was the foundation of mountain wealth, the source of sustenance, and the legacy that fathers passed to sons. Blackwell's attempt to seize timber rights was not merely a business dispute, but an attack on Wesley's ability to provide for his family and to pass something of value to his children. His resistance was not merely stubbornness, but survival. Others have focused on the culture of honor that characterized mountain communities, seeing in Wesley's response the logical conclusion of values that placed personal dignity above all other considerations. They argue that the code by which mountain people lived made his campaign not merely understandable, but inevitable, that any man who had been so publicly humiliated would have been expected to seek revenge. That failure to do so would have marked him as someone unworthy of respect. Sociologists have examined the role that public display played in Wesley's humiliation. The hog-tying was not merely a method of restraint, but a deliberate performance designed to communicate messages to multiple audiences. For the deputies, it demonstrated dominance and power. For the community, it demonstrated that the mountain people could be degraded with impunity. For Wesley himself, it was meant to destroy the sense of self-worth that made resistance possible. Still others have examined the case as an example of how vigilante justice can emerge when official systems fail. The courts had dismissed the charges against Wesley, had acknowledged that the warrant was improper and the arrest unjustified, but had offered no remedy for the brutality he had endured. The law had provided no accountability for those who had beaten and humiliated him, had protected the perpetrators rather than the victim. Wesley's campaign filled a void that the legal system had refused to address. Legal scholars have analyzed the failure to prosecute Wesley despite overwhelming circumstantial evidence. The pattern connecting the killings was clear, the motive was obvious, and witnesses had seen him near several crime scenes. Yet prosecutors chose not to bring charges, presumably understanding that no jury of mountain people would convict him. This de facto jury nullification before the fact represented a community judgment that Wesley's actions, however illegal, were morally justified. Psychologists have examined how Wesley was able to sustain his campaign over more than a year, killing 18 men while maintaining the appearance of normal life. The compartmentalization required was extraordinary. The ability to plan killings while attending church and raising children, suggesting a capacity for focused determination that few possess. His silence about the campaign, maintained for the rest of his life, demonstrated a discipline that matched his marksmanship. You see, what Wesley Edwards did cannot be justified by any conventional legal or moral framework. He killed 18 men, most of them shot without warning, without any opportunity to surrender or defend themselves. The fact that his victims had participated in his humiliation does not eliminate the fact that he acted as judge, jury, and executioner, taking lives that were not his to take. Any society that hopes to maintain order must condemn vigilante killing, regardless of the grievances that motivate it. And yet his story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of criminality that teaches only the obvious lesson that murder is wrong. He was a man who had been beaten without provocation, bound like an animal, dragged through mud and filth for miles, while his tormentors laughed, displayed before his community in a manner designed to strip him of every shred of dignity. The system that should have punished those responsible had instead protected them. There was no legitimate avenue for redress, no institution that would hold the sheriff accountable. What options did he have? What would any man do when faced with such complete destruction of everything that made life worth living? His story challenges us to consider the relationship between law and justice, between what is legal and what is right. The arrest of Wesley Edwards was legal, authorized by a warrant signed by a judge. The beating, the hog-tying, the dragging were all protected by the immunity that law enforcement enjoyed. But none of it was just. Wesley had committed no crime, had merely defended his property against trespassers, had done what any man would have done. His treatment was not law enforcement, but tyranny, not justice, but revenge for daring to resist the powerful. The specific circumstances that produced the Wesley Edwards story, the corrupt alliance between local businessmen and law enforcement, the culture of impunity that allowed deputies to brutalize citizens without consequence, have not entirely disappeared. Similar abuses continue to occur, continue to generate similar responses, continue to raise the same questions about what citizens can do when the system fails them. The reforms that followed Wesley's case addressed some of these problems, but the underlying tensions between authority and liberty remain unresolved. The descendants of Wesley Edwards still live in those Virginia mountains, carrying the memory of their ancestor through the generations. Family reunions include visits to the cemetery where he rests, moments of reflection on a life that encompassed both terrible suffering and terrible vengeance. The story is told to each new generation, ensuring that what happened will not be forgotten, even as those who lived it pass away. The family maintains traditions that connect them to Wesley and Martha, preserving not just the story of the campaign, but the values that had shaped their ancestors' life before that fateful spring day. The importance of honesty in all dealings, the obligation to stand up for what is right, the understanding that dignity must be defended even at great cost. These principles have been transmitted across the generations, forming a heritage that goes beyond the famous story. The children and grandchildren who grew up hearing about Wesley Edwards learned different lessons from different parts of his story. Some emphasized his patience, the 6 months he spent planning while appearing broken. Others focused on his skill, the marksmanship and woodcraft that allowed him to succeed against overwhelming odds. Still others emphasized his love for Martha, the partnership that had sustained him through the ordeal and the prison years that followed. Each generation has found in his story the lessons most relevant to their own circumstances. The mountains of Buchanan County remain today, much as they were in Wesley's time, ancient and patient and indifferent to human drama. The hollow where the farm once stood still shelters the descendants of families who witnessed what happened, who saw Wesley dragged through their community, who later learned what he had done to avenge his honor. The land that was in dispute has long since changed hands many times. The timber that Blackwell sought has long since been harvested and regrown, but the memory of what happened persists. The story of Wesley Edwards endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It is the story of dignity and what happens when dignity is destroyed by those who should protect it. It is the story of honor and the lengths to which people will go to reclaim what has been taken from them. It is the story of justice and what justice means when official channels offer no remedy for official crimes. It is the story of patience and determination, of a man who waited patiently until the time was right, and then struck with a precision that demonstrated exactly what he was capable of when pushed beyond all endurance. It is, finally, a story without easy answers, a tale that resists simple judgments and invites reflection on questions that have no comfortable resolution, but that every society must eventually confront. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand where Wesley Edwards stood, to see the cemetery where he rests, to walk the hollow where he was dragged like an animal before the community that respected him? Would you breathe the mountain air, feel the wind that has blown through these ridges for millennia, sense the presence of history that lingers in certain places? The journey is not easy. The roads are narrow and winding, and the cemetery is difficult to find without a guide who knows the way. But those who make the effort say it is worth it, that standing in that place and knowing that history brings something into focus that cannot be captured in words or photographs. The drive from the lowland towns takes several hours, winding through mountains that seem to rise higher with each passing mile. The pavement gives way to gravel in places, and the gravel gives way to dirt roads that require careful navigation. The isolation that once protected the mountain people from outside interference now makes their communities difficult to reach for those who wish to understand their history. The community welcomes visitors who come with respect, who want to learn rather than judge, who understand that they are entering a place with deep history and strong traditions. The people who live here are proud of their heritage, proud of ancestors who refused to accept unlimited humiliation, proud of the code that demanded response when dignity was violated. They will share their stories if asked politely, will point the way to the cemetery, will help visitors understand the context that makes Wesley Edwards' story comprehensible. The cemetery sits on a hillside overlooking the hollow, surrounded by trees that have grown tall in the decades since Wesley's burial. The stones are simple, weathered by more than half a century of mountain weather, but the names carved into them remain legible. Wesley's stone stands beside Martha's, the couple reunited in death as they had been united in life, their partnership enduring beyond the grave. Standing at those graves, looking out over the mountains that Wesley knew so well, one can almost feel his presence lingering in the wind that rustles through the trees. He is gone, of course, has been gone for decades now, but what he did remains, preserved in memory and in song and in the lessons that his story teaches. The questions he forces us to ask about dignity and justice and the limits of what any person should be expected to endure have no easy answers, which is perhaps why his story continues to resonate so deeply. The mountains keep their secrets, holding the memory of Wesley Edwards close, like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows, and the countless other stories of those who have lived and died among these ancient peaks. His story will continue to be told as long as people remember what happened in Buchanan County during those terrible years, as long as men value their dignity above their safety, as long as systems fail and ordinary people find their own extraordinary ways to respond. He is gone now, dust mingling with the earth beside the ancestors who came before him, but what he did echoes still through time and will continue to echo for generations yet to come. And that, my friend, is the true story of Wesley Edwards, who hunted 18 deputies after they hog-tied him like an animal and dragged him through the mud and filth before his family and community on a spring morning in 1912. A story of dignity and devastating and complete humiliation, of patience and righteous fury, of justice found where the law could not and would not ever provide it. A story that reminds us of the importance of treating every person, regardless of their status or circumstances, with the basic respect that human dignity demands. The lessons of his story remain relevant even today. The tension between authority and individual dignity has not disappeared, and the question of what citizens can do when official systems fail them remains as urgent as ever. Wesley Edwards' answer, the taking of lives in response to the destruction of his honor, cannot be endorsed as a model for others to follow. But his story reminds us why such answers become possible, why the social contract can break down so completely that violence seems like the only remaining option. The reforms that followed his campaign have shaped law enforcement for over a century now. The recognition that prisoners must be treated with basic humanity, that public humiliation serves no legitimate purpose, that authority must be exercised with restraint. These principles were strengthened by the exposure of what had been done to Wesley Edwards and by the terrible consequences that followed. His victims may have been killed by his hand, but they were also victims of a system that had corrupted them, that had taught them that mountain people could be treated as less than human. The mountains remember his name and his deeds and his sacrifice and his absolute and unwavering refusal to accept what had been done to him, and through them, through the songs and stories that continue to be sung and told across these ancient and enduring Appalachian lands, so do we all, now and forever, for all time. As long as memory endures and people gather to hear tales of mountain justice and honor, preserved against impossible odds and dignity, reclaimed through blood and sacrifice, and dignity reclaimed through the only means that remained available when every other avenue had been closed by those who should have provided justice, but chose instead to protect the guilty.